Brandon Moore was supposed to be married today. 100 guests sat waiting, the band softly tuning their instruments, and his mother had already started tearing up in the front row. But there he stood frozen, not at the altar, but at the hallway outside the chapel, staring at a folded note left on the marble floor. It read, "You're too good, but I can't live a life like this." She was gone. No explanation, no goodbye. Just silence. What Brandon did next, no one expected. Not even himself. The ballroom shimmered with gold. Crystal chandeliers poured warm light over white roses, polished cutlery, and rows of neatly lined chairs. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music barely audible over the low murmurs of guests sipping champagne and checking their watches. The wedding was running 10 minutes late, but no one was too concerned. Nerves make up a final touch-up, perhaps. After all, this was Brandon Moore's wedding day. The man who had built a $1 million tech company from scratch. The man everyone described as humble, kind, and deeply in love. Brandon himself stood at the end of the hallway, his tailored navy suit sharp against the marble walls. His best man clapped a hand on his shoulder, teasing nervous, yet Brandon gave a half smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Something felt off. Emily hadn't responded to his last message, and her bridal suite hadn't answered either, but he brushed it aside. Maybe she needed a quiet moment. It was her big day too. And then, the hotel manager came running. "Sir, this was found just outside the bridal suite. I think it's for you." A simple folded note, no envelope. Brandon took it confused. The writing was unmistakably hers. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. "You're too good, but I can't live a life like this." That was it. One sentence. No signature. No second page. The silence that followed was deafening. The world narrowed to a pinhole as Brandon stared at the words, reading them over and over, as if a different message would appear if he blinked long enough. Behind him, laughter echoed from the banquet room. Someone called out, "They're here," but no one was. Not her. Not Emily. Guests started to murmur. The groomsman looked around. The officiant checked his watch again. A bridesmaid approached quietly, whispering, "Have you seen Emily?" Brandon didn't answer. He couldn't. He stood rooted in place, the note crushed slightly in his hand chest, rising and falling with shallow breaths. His mother stepped out from the ballroom, worry etched across her face. "Baby, is everything all right?" He met her eyes and something in him cracked. But he didn't cry. Not yet. The minutes dragged. Eventually the whispers grew into questions. Phones buzzed. A few guests began to put their jackets back on. One man muttered, "I knew something was off about her." Another sighed. "This is humiliating." Brandon's best friend pulled him aside. "Man, we can still cancel the reception, pack it up. No one will judge you. Let's just get out of here." Brandon said nothing. He walked to the edge of the ballroom, peering through the open doors. The room was glowing tablecloths, pristine. The cake a towering masterpiece. Candles flickering gently. Everything was perfect, except the bride. He saw the chairs filled with faces, some friends, some colleagues, many people who flew in just to celebrate his joy. The staff stood by with trays of food prepared for 200, and all of it would now go to waste just like that. He looked down at the crumpled note again. Read the words one last time, then folded it neatly and tucked it into his breast pocket. He turned to his best man and said quietly but clearly, "No. We're not canceling anything." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're going to have a celebration tonight, just not the one we planned." And with that, Brandon Moore made a phone call that would change not just the rest of his evening, but the rest of his life. Brandon Moore made a phone call that night, but before that decision could ripple out into something larger than himself, there was the silence. The kind that sits with a man long after the music stops. And to understand why that silence didn't crush him, why he stood tall instead of collapsing under the weight of public humiliation, you'd have to know the kind of man Brandon Moore was long before this wedding ever happened. At 35, Brandon had the kind of life that most would envy, but few truly understood. He was a self-made tech entrepreneur, the founder of a digital platform that matched underrepresented youth with scholarship mentors and coding apprenticeships. What started from a cramped apartment in Southside Chicago had grown into a nationally recognized nonprofit turned startup, funded by both Silicon Valley investors and grassroots support. But for all his success, Brandon remained surprisingly grounded. The kind of man who still coached youth basketball on weekends, who sent flowers to his high school English teacher every year on her birthday, who once spent his Christmas morning handing out socks at a homeless shelter instead of opening gifts. His humility was not performative. It was carved into him by his late father, who worked 2 jobs and still found time to read bedtime stories, and by his mother, who raised 3 boys with nothing but a cafeteria job and iron will. Brandon's life was a living tribute to those roots. He wore his suit with quiet pride, never flashy, never loud. His smile was soft, but his values were steel. So when he met Emily Carter at a medical fundraiser 3 years prior, something clicked. She was a trauma surgeon at Northwestern Memorial, brilliant and sharp-witted with a laugh that didn't come easily, but stayed with you when it did. Their first conversation wasn't about careers or ambition. It was about childhood books. He mentioned the Phantom toll booth, and her face lit up. They talked for 3 hours straight. They started slow. Emily was private, careful with her heart, often retreating behind clinical language or logic when things got too emotional. But Brandon, with his patient steadiness, made space for her. He never pushed, just waited like water wearing down stone until she slowly let him in. Their relationship, at least to the outside world, looked idyllic. Photos of them at charity galas, Sunday brunches, and lakefront walks painted a picture of a modern love story. 2 accomplished professionals finding connection beyond race, beyond pressure. But beneath it all, there were quiet fractures. Nothing explosive, just unspoken things. Emily never liked to talk about race. When Brandon brought up the challenges he'd faced as a Black founder in predominantly white spaces, she'd nod but change the subject. She avoided his neighborhood in Southside even when invited. At a dinner with Brandon's cousins, she seemed distant, distracted. Once she admitted she felt out of place around his family, not because they weren't welcoming, but because she feared they saw her as temporary. Still, there were no fights, no ultimatums, no dramatic warnings. They planned the wedding like any other couple: venue tours, menu tastings, guest lists, flowers. Brandon handled most of it. He said he wanted to make it easy for her, but truthfully, he loved the idea of building something permanent, something that felt like home. He poured himself into every detail, from the gospel choir during the prelude to the lemon elderflower cake she once casually mentioned she liked. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a dream he'd carried since he was a teenager, watching his parents slow dance in the kitchen after dinner. Everyone expected it to be perfect. His brothers flew in early. His mother got a new dress. His friends teased him about how serious he was getting. And Emily, she never showed a flicker of doubt. Not once. Not even the night before, when they spoke on the phone, and she said softly, "I can't wait to see you tomorrow." And then that note. One sentence written in handwriting he'd memorized like scripture. "You're too good, but I can't live a life like this." What life was she talking about? A life with him, a life outside her comfort zone, a life that came with complexities her world never asked her to face. He would never know for sure. But what he did know, standing there in the hallway with that note pressed to his chest, was this: she was gone, and she wasn't coming back. Still as the candles flickered and the music drifted on, Brandon Moore stood in the wreckage of his dreams and made a different choice. He didn't collapse. He didn't run. He turned toward the ballroom, toward the light, and walked back in, not as a groom, but as a man who refused to let pain define him. There was something hauntingly quiet about the way Brandon walked back into the ballroom. The chatter dulled when guests turned to see him without Emily. No tuxedoed best man beside him. No soft piano cue signaling her entrance. Just Brandon alone, the faintest crease on his brow, like someone trying to remember whether he'd locked the door before leaving the house. Except what he was forgetting wasn't simple at all. What he was losing, he couldn't get back. The room decked in ivory and gold now felt like a cathedral of questions. And the biggest question, where is she, soon gave way to an even bigger one: what happens now? At first, no one outside the inner circle knew. The officiant stood near the altar, glancing at his notes, waiting for a cue that never came. The string quartet faltered, then stopped playing altogether. And then the whispering began. It started in the corners, polite and hesitant, but quickly spread like spilled wine. She's not here. She's not coming. Not. Something happened. In the hallway, Brandon's brothers tried to shield him, ushering him aside, suggesting he take a moment, maybe leave through the service exit, spare himself the embarrassment. But he just shook his head and said calmly, "Give me a minute." He found a quiet room down the hall, an empty conference suite that smelled faintly of stale coffee and furniture polish, and sat down, the note still warm from his chest pocket. He read it again. "You're too good, but I can't live a life like this." 8 words. 8 syllables that unraveled 3 years of shared memories, hundreds of nights spent planning, laughing, leaning on each other. But what was she really saying? That he was too good, or that her world didn't have space for someone like him, no matter how kind, how successful, how deeply he loved? It wasn't the first time Brandon had seen people walk away from things they didn't understand. He'd lost investors who loved his ideas but flinched when he brought up racial equity. He'd been at fundraisers where people smiled at him, but gripped their wallets tighter. He'd sat in boardrooms where no one said it out loud, but he could feel it in their gaze. "You don't quite belong here." Maybe Emily had felt the same in reverse. Maybe the gap between their worlds, him from Southside Chicago, her from a private suburb in Evanston, had grown too wide for love to bridge. Maybe her family's subtle disapproval had sunk deeper than either of them had admitted. Maybe she wasn't ready to fight for a life that would mean constantly stepping out of comfort and into questions. Still, Brandon didn't cry. Not yet. Back in the ballroom, things were unraveling quickly. Guests began packing their things. A woman in a blue dress whispered too loudly, "She always seemed a little off, didn't she?" A family friend muttered, "Poor Brandon. What a humiliation." Others were more practical. "Can they get their deposit back?" "Should we stay for the dinner? I flew in from Houston for this." His mother, who had worn her finest church hat and a satin shawl he'd bought her for Mother's Day, sat with her hands in her lap, staring at the altar like it might apologize. When someone told her gently what had happened, her breath hitched. She didn't make a scene, but the tears welled up fast, the kind that came from seeing your child hurt in a way you couldn't fix. The buzz grew louder, and soon the press took notice. A few local outlets had been invited to cover the wedding. It was, after all, a high-profile event featuring 2 respected black and white professionals in Chicago's civic circle. The power couple narrative was ready to be written, but now the angle had changed. A reporter from the Tribune sent a text to her editor, "Bride no-show. Groom's reaction unknown. Story developing." Through it all, Brandon remained still. When his best man returned to ask what he wanted to do, Brandon finally stood up. There was no anger in his voice, no accusation. Just a question so quiet it barely touched the air. "What are we supposed to do with all this food?" His friend blinked. What Brandon looked past him toward the banquet hall. "There's enough food for 200 people in there. Tables are set, staff's ready, cake's made. What, we just throw it all away? I mean, we could box it up, maybe donate it." Brandon paused, a strange calm settling over him, as if he'd finally found the eye of the storm. "No," he said, "we're not boxing it up. We're going to use it, just not for who we thought." And in that moment, before the headlines, before the applause, before the viral posts, Brandon Moore made a decision, not out of bitterness or pride, but something far quieter and braver. He refused to let one broken promise end the night in silence. He refused to let one broken promise end the night in silence. And once Brandon made that decision, he moved with the kind of quiet urgency only heartbreak can fuel. There was no grand speech, no dramatic moment of redemption. Just a man still in his wedding suit walking calmly through the echoing halls of a 5-star hotel in downtown Chicago, asking staff to gather for a meeting. The event coordinator, a woman named Teresa, with tight curls and a clipboard that rarely left her hand, looked at him as if trying to gauge whether he was joking. "You want to still go ahead with the reception?" she asked slowly. Brandon shook his head. "Not the reception we planned. But yes, I want to serve the food. Light the candles, keep the music. Just different guests." She blinked, thrown off. "Different." He took a breath as if steadying himself against the wave he was about to unleash. "Do you know any shelters nearby, or community kitchens? Anyone who could bring people here tonight? People who might need a meal or a warm room or just to feel like they matter?" Teresa's eyes widened. She stared at him, then at the ballroom behind them, lavish, glowing, untouched. You want to give your wedding dinner to strangers. He nodded once. To neighbors. There was a pause. Then something softened in her face and she smiled not out of pity, but recognition. Give me 20 minutes. For the next few hours, Brandon was on the phone calling shelters, soup kitchens, halfway houses. The staff helped too. Word spread faster than anyone expected. Calls were made, vans arranged, messages passed hand to hand. By early evening, guests began to arrive, not in tuxedos or satin gowns, but in coats, patched at the elbows, boots worn thin, and eyes blinking against the chandelier light as if they'd stepped into a different world entirely. The doormen welcomed them like VIPs. No one asked for names. No one judged appearances. One older man removed his knit cap and whispered, "You sure this ain't a mistake?" The server smiled and said, "You're right on time, sir." By 7 p.m., the room was full, 80 people, maybe more, seated at tables that had once been reserved for city officials, CEOs, and family friends. Now they were occupied by single mothers, Vietnam vets, seniors who lived alone, men and women who had gone unseen for years until tonight. Brandon didn't hover. He didn't stand at the head table. He walked from table to table, pouring water, serving bread, asking people how they liked the chicken marsala. There was a live jazz trio already paid for, so the music played on, smooth and tender, giving the room a strange kind of peace. Children giggled as they tasted lemon cake. A man in his 60s clapped after every song. Someone asked if there would be dancing. Someone else whispered, "This is the first time I've had a real meal in weeks." When the plates were nearly cleared, and the soft hum of full bellies replaced the clatter of forks, Brandon stood near the small stage. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't cry. "I just want to say thank you," he said, his hands folded in front of him. "Today was supposed to be about love, and it still is. I didn't lose anything today. I still have love, just not in the way I thought. So tonight I wanted to share it with you." There was a moment of silence, then applause. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real. And in that moment, Brandon wasn't a man abandoned at the altar. He was a man who had turned loss into a kind of abundance most people never get to witness. From the far corner of the ballroom, a young woman watched him. She wore navy blue scrubs and had come at the last minute when her shift ended early. She had no idea what she was walking into, just that someone at the hospital said a man was giving away his wedding dinner to the homeless and that he wasn't doing it for attention. Just because. Her name was Maya Thompson, a trauma nurse who had seen far too much of what people do to each other when pain goes unspoken. But tonight, watching Brandon speak, she saw something rare, a man who had not only been broken, but rebuilt himself mid-fall and somehow was still looking outward, still offering love to others. She didn't approach him that night. She didn't need to. She simply stood quietly in the back, her eyes never leaving him, already knowing in the deepest part of her spirit, she would remember this man for a very long time. For most people in that ballroom, the night ended with full stomachs and an unspoken warmth they hadn't felt in years. But for one guest, a teenage volunteer from a local youth center, it ended with a video. He had filmed the moment Brandon gave his short, quiet speech, not for fame or likes, but because something about it felt sacred. He posted it on Twitter with a simple caption, "This man got left at the altar today, and still threw a wedding dinner for people who needed it more." By morning, the clip had crossed 200,000 views. By afternoon, it was trending nationwide. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. In a world hungry for scandal, here was something different, something tender and defiant in its gentleness. News outlets picked it up within hours. Chicago GROOM rewrites. Heartbreak read one headline. Bride is a no-show, so GROOM feeds the homeless, instead read another. Cable talk shows debated his motives. Influencers called it the most wholesome content of the year. But Brandon didn't answer any interview requests. He politely declined appearances on national morning shows, ignored the flood of emails asking him to share his journey, and left producers with nothing but silence. Instead, 2 days after the wedding that wasn't, he posted a single message on his personal account. "Thank you to everyone who came. Thank you to everyone who stayed. Love still exists. I'm just grateful I had enough to share." That was it. No hashtags, no link in bio, no follow-up. Still, the story refused to fade. For weeks, people reposted the clip with new captions. New tears, new declarations of restored faith in humanity. A teacher in Milwaukee played it for her students during a lesson on compassion. A church in Atlanta showed it during Sunday service. A woman in Brazil said it reminded her of her grandfather. But Brandon disappeared from the spotlight just as suddenly as he had entered it. He returned to work scaling back public events, keeping his head down. Friends said he looked the same, maybe a little quieter. He still showed up to youth basketball, still volunteered, still sent flowers to his mother every month. But no one, not even his closest friends, dared ask him about love. Rumors swirled, of course, that he was secretly dating again, that he'd moved on with someone normal this time, that maybe the whole thing had scarred him too deeply. But Brandon never confirmed or denied anything. He just smiled in that quiet way he did and kept walking. And then almost exactly a year later, something shifted. The city was hosting a fundraising gala for community health initiatives, and Brandon, known for his past generosity, had been invited. He arrived late, blending into the crowd, with ease, nodding politely to familiar faces, trying not to attract attention. But across the room, Maya Thompson had seen him the moment he walked in. She hadn't expected him to be there. Truthfully, she'd almost skipped the gala herself. It had been a long week at the hospital, and her shift had drained her. But something pulled her there, perhaps the same quiet instinct that had brought her to that wedding dinner a year earlier. They locked eyes briefly, just a flicker through the crowd, but it was enough. Later that evening, as the speeches wrapped up and people drifted toward the bar or slipped out into the night, Brandon stepped out onto the balcony for air. Maya was already there, her arms folded on the railing, eyes fixed on the lights of downtown Chicago. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city buzzed beneath them, full of stories. Then she said softly, "You never looked for attention, did you?" Brandon smiled, that same steady curve of the lips she remembered. "Never really knew what I'd do with it." She turned to face him. "That night, you changed something in me." He met her gaze this time, holding it longer. There was no pity in her eyes, no wide-eyed admiration, just clarity, familiarity. The look of someone who had seen him not as a broken man, but as a whole one carved not by pain, but by what he did with it. "I remember you," he said. "You were standing near the back, blue scrubs, hair tied up." She smiled. "And you were serving water like a maitre d' at a five-star restaurant." They both laughed, soft, easy, unguarded. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a reunion of star-crossed souls. It was something gentler. A moment between two people who had lived long enough to know that sometimes love begins not in fireworks, but in the quiet return of someone who had simply stayed. After that night on the balcony, they didn't fall into anything dramatic. There was no flurry of text messages, no whirlwind courtship, no declarations under the rain. What unfolded between Brandon and Maya was slower, quieter, something more like the steady unfolding of dawn than the sudden blaze of fireworks. They began to run into each other more often. At first, it was at community events, fundraisers, clinic drives, youth mentorship panels. Then it was at smaller gatherings, ones that didn't require invitations-only intention. Brandon would volunteer at the same shelters Maya rotated through for mobile health checkups. She started showing up to his foundation's weekend coding workshops, offering snacks and first aid kits to wide-eyed kids who had never seen a black man in a blazer and a woman in scrubs speak to them like equals. What surprised them most wasn't how easily their rhythms aligned, but how effortlessly the conversations flowed. They talked about everything: race, grief, burnout, hope. Maya told him about losing a patient to an overdose and how it made her feel like she was sinking in invisible water. Brandon told her about his father's hands, how rough they were, how safe they made him feel. There was no pressure to impress, no curated versions of self. Just two people with different paths, each learning how to be seen without flinching. It was months before anything romantic stirred between them. And even then, it came not in a kiss, but in a question. One afternoon, after distributing meals on the South Side, Maya turned to him, her voice half playful, but entirely sincere. "Do you ever think about love again?" Brandon paused. Then, instead of answering, he said, "I remember your eyes from that night." She blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean, that dinner? You were standing near the back by the wall. You didn't eat. You didn't talk much, but you were watching, not like the others. You weren't confused or sad. You looked like you understood." Maya nodded, the wind brushing a curl loose from behind her ear. I did, because I'd felt that kind of grief before, and I'd never seen someone carry it the way you did. From that point on, something shifted, not rushed, not dramatic, just sure. They began meeting intentionally, not just by chance. Coffee turned to walks, walks turned to dinners, dinners turned to quiet evenings in each other's presence, not needing to fill the silence with anything more than the rhythm of breath and knowing. Brandon wasn't looking for a replacement. Maya wasn't looking to be chosen to fill a void. They were two people who had known enough heartbreak to recognize the difference between someone who needs healing and someone who wants to heal with you. A year after they first reconnected, they stood in front of a small gathering on a spring morning in Jackson Park. There were no camera crews, no floral archways, no five-tier cake or string quartets. Just folding chairs in the grass, handmade signs that read, "Love still exists," and a circle of familiar faces, his mother, her sister, childhood friends, and a few guests from that night long ago. Some of the men wore suits for the first time in decades. Some of the women came with children who still remembered the lemon cake. One man who had once slept under the Wabash Bridge stood tall beside the table, now a full-time shelter cook, thanks to a connection Brandon had made. They were more than guests, they were part of the story. Maya wore a pale ivory dress, simple and elegant, her hair pinned back with gardenias. Brandon wore a soft gray suit, no tie, just a small pocket square, embroidered with the initials of his late father. The officiant read a poem, not a scripture. And when it was time for vows, they spoke not of perfection, but of choice. How every day they would choose presence over pride, listening over certainty, love over fear. And then just before the reception of barbecue and peach cobbler began, a soft murmur rippled through the crowd. Standing near the edge of the gathering was a familiar face one Brandon hadn't seen in 2 years. Emily. She hadn't come to make a scene. She hadn't even come by invitation. She was in town for a medical conference and had heard whispers from a mutual acquaintance. Now she stood hesitant but not ashamed, watching with an expression that was hard to read, part sorrow, part respect. Brandon caught sight of her as he was returning from a quiet word with the DJ. For a brief second, their eyes met across the grass. He didn't freeze. He didn't flinch. He simply nodded once, not in bitterness, but in peace. Maya, who had been watching the same moment unfold, reached for his hand. Her fingers curled gently around his, not possessively, but protectively. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to, because this time Brandon wasn't alone. And this love, this life wasn't built on what had been lost, but what had been quietly, patiently, faithfully found. The wedding in Jackson Park didn't make headlines. No news vans rolled up, no hashtags trended. But for those who stood barefoot in the dewy grass that morning, those who had once been invisible, overlooked, discarded, it was the most sacred thing they had witnessed in years. And for Brandon and Maya, it wasn't just the start of a marriage. It was the start of something bigger than both of them. In the weeks that followed, they turned that quiet ceremony into momentum. Together, they founded an organization called Still Exists Foundation, named after the words that had echoed through Brandon's soul since the night he'd been left at the altar. What began as a simple mission to feed and shelter grew quickly into something more layered, more human. The foundation provided temporary housing for people transitioning out of homelessness, but it also offered counseling, legal aid, job training, and perhaps most importantly, a sense of dignity. Maya took the lead on mental health programming, drawing from her years as a trauma nurse. Brandon focused on the housing partnerships and funding efforts, using his network to rally both grassroots supporters and deep-pocket donors who wanted to invest in something that wasn't just charity, but community building. What set their foundation apart wasn't just the services, it was the philosophy behind it, that love, when freely given, had the power to rebuild what the world had tried to erase. And people noticed, not because Brandon and Maya asked for attention, but because goodness has a way of surfacing even when it tries to stay quiet. Community leaders began inviting them to speak not about statistics or strategy, but about heart. Students wrote essays about their story. Retired teachers volunteered at the foundation because, as one woman said, "These two remind me why I got into this work to begin with." They didn't become celebrities. They became pillars, soft-spoken, accessible, present. The kind of couple who would show up to a gala in thrifted suits just to make sure every donation went where it mattered. The kind of couple who still made time every Sunday to visit the very shelter where they'd first crossed paths. And somewhere along the way, a letter arrived at the foundation. Handwritten. No return address. Just a few lines. Thank you for not hating me. Thank you for choosing love. I couldn't live that life then, but I'm grateful it led you here. It was signed Simply Emily. Brandon didn't tell many people about the note. He tucked it into a drawer with the folded wedding invitation. He never sent the pocket square from that first suit and a photo of the dinner he served the night everything changed. Not as mementos of pain, but as proof that even shattered things could shine if held in the right light. Over time, their story began to take root beyond Chicago. A college professor in Oregon assigned it as a case study in Grace Under Crisis. A pastor in New Orleans preached about it one Easter morning. A counselor in New Mexico read it aloud to a group of teens who had stopped believing in anything. And everywhere it traveled, the core message remained intact. True love doesn't come dressed in grandeur. It comes clothed in patience, carved by loss, and carried by those who still believe, even after the world gives them every reason not to. A journalist once wrote of Brandon in an op-ed that circulated quietly but never left the hearts of those who read it. He was never abandoned. He was redirected, guided even toward the life that had been waiting for him all along. And perhaps that's the greatest truth of all, that sometimes what feels like rejection is simply rerouting, that not every closed door is a punishment, some are protection, and that the heart, when kept open long enough, will always find its way home. Brandon and Maya never claimed to be an example, but for those who had lost faith in love in its depth, its endurance, its quiet triumph, they were a reminder that the real kind of love doesn't disappear when things go wrong. It doesn't flinch when tested. It doesn't vanish at the altar. It waits, it watches, and then when the time is right, it walks in and stays. And for those still carrying the weight of old wounds, let this be the echo that reaches you across the years. Don't close your heart just because someone else was too afraid to walk in. Because how in true love, the kind that heals, the kind that lasts, never runs. Thank you for watching this story of love loss and quiet redemption. If it touched your heart, please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, or sharing it with someone who needs to believe in love again. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Because somewhere out there, love still exists,